When people hear the name Adobe, they instinctively think of Photoshop, glowing retouching tools, and the quiet power behind almost every image poster video and PDF they have ever encountered. What is less immediately visible is that Adobe's real achievement is not a single piece of software, but a rare and difficult transformation, the evolution from a product-based creative tools company into a platform that reshaped how creativity itself is produced, distributed, and valued in the digital age. The history of Adobe is not just a software story. It is a story about standards ecosystems and the courage to dismantle your own most successful business before someone else does it for you. Adobe's origins lie far from glamour. Founded in 1982 by John Warnock and Charles Geschke, two former Xerox PARC researchers, Adobe began with a technical problem that few outside publishing even noticed. Digital text and graphics could not be printed reliably across different machines. What you saw on screen did not match what came out of the printer. This inconsistency was a barrier to the future of digital publishing. Adobe's solution was PostScript, a page description language that translated digital designs into precise instructions printers could understand. This was not a consumer product. It was infrastructure. Adobe's first great success came from making computers trustworthy for serious work. PostScript quietly changed the world. Combined with Apple's Macintosh and affordable laser printers, it ignited the desktop publishing revolution. Designers' magazines and businesses suddenly had professional control over layout and typography. Adobe did not sell creativity directly at first. It sold certainty. That certainty became the foundation on which creative software could flourish. From the beginning, Adobe learned a lesson that would define its future. When you control the standard, you shape the ecosystem. The transition from infrastructure to creativity came with a series of acquisitions and internal innovations that would define an era. Illustrator brought vector graphics into the mainstream. Acrobat and the PDF standardized digital documents, globally embedding Adobe into governments, corporations, and legal systems. But nothing defined Adobe's public identity like Photoshop, originally developed by two brothers as a niche image editing tool. Photoshop became the lingua franca of digital imagery after Adobe acquired it in 1988. Over time, the software transcended its category. To Photoshop, something became a verb, a sign that Adobe had not just built a tool, but shaped language and perception. Yet Photoshop's dominance also planted the seeds of Adobe's greatest challenge. Creative software was sold as boxed products with expensive upgrades every few years. This model generated enormous revenue, but it also created friction. Piracy was rampant. Updates were infrequent. Independent creators struggled to afford tools. Adobe faced a paradox common to successful companies. The model that made you powerful also limits who you can serve next. The world was moving toward continuous updates, cloud distribution, and subscription access. Adobe could see this coming. The question was whether it was willing to risk everything to get there. This moment defines Adobe's modern history. In 2012, Adobe made one of the most controversial decisions in tech. It announced the end of perpetual licenses for its flagship creative tools and the full transition to Creative Cloud, a subscription-based model. Customers revolted. Stock prices dropped. Critics accused Adobe of arrogance and greed. Internally, the company faced a temporary collapse in revenue. Adobe was dismantling its cash cow in public betting that long-term stability was worth short-term pain. This was not a pivot forced by failure. It was a preemptive act of self-disruption. This shift also changed Adobe's relationship with its users. Subscriptions lowered barriers for students and freelancers while increasing lifetime value per customer. Piracy declined dramatically because access became easier than theft. Data insights, allowed Adobe to understand how tools were actually used, informing development decisions. The company moved from selling ownership to selling continuity. You did not buy Photoshop anymore. You lived inside Adobe's creative universe. As Adobe stabilized Creative Cloud, it expanded its ambition. Marketing analytics and experience management entered the portfolio through Adobe Experience Cloud. This marked another identity shift. Adobe was no longer only empowering creators. It was helping businesses understand, personalize, and monetize digital experiences. Creativity and commerce began to converge. Design decisions could now be informed by data, and data could be expressed creatively. Adobe positioned itself at the intersection of imagination and measurement, a place few companies could credibly occupy. Throughout this transformation, Adobe maintained a distinctive cultural tone. Unlike companies that chased viral products or consumer hype, Adobe stayed focused on professionals. Its brand was not cool in a consumer sense, it was trusted. Adobe software was expected to work under pressure in studios' deadlines and production pipelines, where failure was costly. This seriousness insulated Adobe from fashion cycles. Creators might complain about pricing or interfaces, but abandoning Adobe entirely was rarely practical. The tools had become embedded in how creative work was done. And yet, even as Creative Cloud succeeded financially and strategically, new tensions emerged. Subscription fatigue grew. AI began to challenge traditional creative workflows. Questions about authorship automation and originality surfaced. Adobe, once the enabler of human creativity, now stood at the edge of a future where machines could generate images, text, and designs at scale. The company's history suggested adaptability, but the stakes were existential again, because once creativity itself becomes software-driven, the role of a company like Adobe must be redefined yet again. And that unresolved tension is the unfinished thought we must now carry forward into the next part, where Adobe's journey from Photoshop to Creative Cloud confronts artificial intelligence, creator identity, and the question of whether tools that once empowered artists can remain trusted allies in an era where creativity can be automated faster than humans can imagine. And that is where the story must continue next. And when this unresolved tension is carried into the age of artificial intelligence, Adobe's history comes full circle because the company that once made machines reliable for human creativity must now decide how machines participate in creativity itself. AI is not just another feature upgrade. It challenges the emotional contract Adobe has held with creators for decades. Photoshop, Illustrator. Premiere and After Effects were always tools that amplified intent. They were powerful, but passive. They waited for the human hand and mind to act. Generative AI introduces a different dynamic the tool can now propose, suggest, and even originate. The question Adobe faces is not whether to adopt AI, but how to do so without dissolving trust. Adobe's response reveals how deeply its past has shaped its instincts. Rather than positioning AI as a replacement for creators, Adobe frames it as a collaborator. Firefly, its generative AI platform, was introduced not as a spectacle, but as an extension of existing workflows. The emphasis was deliberate. AI should remove friction, not authorship. It should accelerate ideation, not overwrite judgment. This echoes the logic behind PostScript, and Creative Cloud technology exists to make human output more reliable, more scalable, and more expressive, not to eclipse it. One of Adobe's most strategic decisions in this era has been its stance on training data and ethics. While competitors rushed to scrape the internet indiscriminately, Adobe anchored Firefly in licensed, owned, or permissioned content. This choice limited short-term capability, but protected long-term legitimacy. Adobe understands its audience. Professional creators care deeply about ownership attribution and livelihood. trust once broken is nearly impossible to recover. By aligning AI development with creator rights, Adobe is attempting to institutionalize ethics as a competitive advantage rather than a constraint. This approach also reflects Adobe's deeper understanding of how creativity actually works. Creativity is not just output, it is process, revision, and intent. AI can generate infinite variations, but humans decide which variation matters. Adobe's tools increasingly reflect this hierarchy. AI handles the repetitive, the technical, the exploratory. Humans retain control over direction, meaning, and final judgment. In this model, speed increases without flattening authorship. Automation serves taste rather than replacing it. At the same time, Adobe cannot ignore the economic anxiety AI introduces. If images, layouts, and videos can be generated instantly, what happens to the value of creative labor? Adobe's answer is subtle but consistent with its history. Value shifts upward. When execution becomes easier, concept strategy and storytelling become more important. Adobe positions its platform not just as a generator, but as a system for managing creative complexity across teams, brands, and channels. In other words, as creativity becomes cheaper to produce, coherence becomes more valuable. This is familiar terrain for Adobe. It has always thrived where chaos needed structure. The integration of AI into Creative Cloud also reinforces Adobe's ecosystem advantage. Standalone AI tools can impress in isolation, but professional work rarely happens in isolation. Files move across applications, collaborators, deadlines, and clients. Adobe's strength lies in owning the connective tissue. AI features embedded across the suite feel less like disruption and more like evolution. This continuity matters. Creators do not have to relearn how to work. They extend how they already work. Looking back, Adobe's journey from Photoshop to Creative Cloud to AI reveals a consistent pattern. The company does not chase novelty. It absorbs inevitability. Desktop publishing was inevitable. Cloud delivery was inevitable. AI-assisted creativity is inevitable. Adobe's survival has depended not on being first, but on being credible when adoption becomes unavoidable. This patience has allowed Adobe to move slowly enough to be trusted and fast enough to remain relevant. The deeper lesson of Adobe's history is that tools shape identity. For millions of creators, Adobe software is not optional. It is part of how they think, plan, and express. This intimacy carries responsibility. When Adobe changes its tools, it changes creative behavior at scale. Few companies wield such quiet influence. That is why Adobe's choices around AI matter far beyond quarterly earnings. They help define whether the next era of creativity feels empowering or extractive, collaborative or alienating. In the end, Adobe's legacy is not about Photoshop PDFs or subscriptions. It is about stewardship. Stewardship of standards. Stewardship of creative trust. Stewardship of the boundary between human intention and machine capability. The company that once solved the problem of making digital work printable now faces a more profound task, making machine-assisted creativity feel human, accountable, and worthy of belief. And that is the unfinished but emerging truth of Adobe's story. Creativity will change. Tools will evolve. Automation will accelerate. But as long as there are people who care about meaning, authorship, and expression, there will be a need for systems that respect those values at scale. Adobe's challenge is not to win the AI race. It is to ensure that when creativity runs faster than ever, it does not lose its soul in the process. If this deep exploration of Adobe's evolution has reshaped how you think about creativity, technology, and trust, consider subscribing to the channel so you can continue this journey through the companies that quietly shape how we work. And imagine and leave a comment sharing whether you see AI as a threat or an amplifier of human creativity, because that question will define not just Adobe's future, but the future of creation itself.